Edward Estlin Cummings, born October of 1894 and died September of 1962, was a prominent American poet who is most often remembered for his unique yet avant-garde style of poetry. He expanded boundaries of poetry through typographic and linguistic experimentation, in particular idiosyncrasy of syntax, or way of arranging individual words into larger phrases and sentences. While some of his poetry is free verse, with no concern for rhyme or meter, one could say he destroyed the conventional idea of poetry and breathed eccentricity into the world of poetry. Common themes Cummings explored was love and nature, exemplified in I Carry Your Heart With Me and The Spring Has Been Exquisite. Cummings was admitted at Harvard University in September 1911 and received a degree of Bachelor of Arts in 1915, graduating magna cum laude. The same year, his poems were published in Harvard Advocate. The following year, in 1916, he acquired his master's degree in English and Classical Studies, again from the Harvard University itself. In addition to being an accomplished poet, Cummings exhibited talents in multiple facets of the arts that include being an accomplished playwright, author, essayist, and even a painter. Throughout his life, Cummings would often travel to many countries, particularly throughout Europe, which included France and even Soviet Russia. Cummings went on to earn both his BA and his MA by 1916 from Harvard University, where his father taught before going on to serve in World War I overseas as a volunteer for the Ambulance Corps. A pacifist, Cummings was imprisoned for several months by French authorities for suspicion of treason due to letters he had written. He later recounted his jail experiences in his autobiographical novel, The Enormous Room, published in 1922. These travels, among other things, would have a profound influential effect on his style of writing. Juxtaposed with the obvious historical context present, an example World War I, the Roaring Twenties, etc., excerpts of Cummings' life experience can often be found directly in the works he produced. With that said, these aspects of his life, in addition to the historical context of the time period, have influenced Cummings to a very high degree that can be seen in just about every work composed. Cummings was born into a Christian family that practiced a one-person understanding of God, Unitarian. As a result, would have transcendental leanings his entire life. Transcendental meaning the inherent goodness of both man and nature. Growing up, it was evident that Cummings had a special talent for writing. As an early bloomer, Cummings wrote a poem a day, exploring many traditional poetic forms. By the time he was in Harvard, modern poetry had caught his interest. This can be said to have eventually led to his avant-garde reputation with respect to his unique style of writing. However, during his early life, it is hard to determine the historical context of the late 1800s, early 1900s had any sort of profound effect on Cummings as is not evident in his very early work. However, by the time World War I broke out, the context of this historical time began showing more and more. Cummings had stayed in Paris initially when he enlisted to serve. His love for the city, his subsequent and often frequent visits later on, would end up becoming the main focus for many of his works in addition to his poetry. Additionally, in 1931, Cummings traveled to the Soviet Union. Predisposed to enjoy the trip, Cummings found his personal sense of individualism disturbed by the lack of intellectual and artistic freedom that he found. Eventually, he would later publish his experiences from his diary titled I Am. Suffice to say, the experiences he had with traveling all across Europe during a time period which many would consider to be turbulent, the work that Cummings produced certainly showed that his many experiences had an effect on the work he produced. During the later part of his life, Cummings would spend most of his time traveling for leisure, give lectures at his alma mater, and spend time in his summer home. With the Second World War having been over nearly a decade, Cummings' later work was mainly satirical, often addressing pressing social issues while simultaneously poking fun towards the subject at the same time. By the time in his life, he had already garnered a controversial reputation for being mostly unconventional with his delivery and style of writing. However, the writing he presented was often satirical and not so much about the historical context that he was forced to endure. Because of this, the later parts of his life, aside from his satirical works and lecture obligations, were mainly uneventful. It can be said that the historical times and the conditions this poet had lived through were indicative in his writing from childhood into most of his adulthood. However, the same cannot be said for the later part of his life. Furthermore, E. E. Cummings was a prominent American poet who had multiple talents in many areas of literature. In his life, he experienced war firsthand, experienced the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the lack of intellectualism in certain countries like Soviet Russia. These experiences, all juxtaposed with the important historical contexts that were present at the time, were often always found in the works he produced, which included essays, paintings, and often novels, in addition to his poetry. With his experience came a great deal of poetry that will be cherished for years to come. Cummings received several awards, including the Dial Award, Guggenheim Fellowship, Shelley Memorial Award for Poetry, Harriet Monroe Prize for Poetry Magazine, Fellowship of American Academy of Poets, Guggenheim Fellowship, again in 1951, Charles Eliot Norton Professorship at Harvard, a special citation from the National Book Award Committee for his poems in 1957, the Bollingen Prize in Poetry, the Boston Arts Festival Award, and a 2-year Ford Foundation grant of $15,000. If freckles were lovely, and day was night, and measles were nice, and a lie wasn't a lie, life would be a delight. But things couldn't go right, for in such a sad plight, I wouldn't be I. If earth was heaven, and now was hence, and past was present, and false was true, there might be some sense. But I'd be in suspense, for on such a pretense, you wouldn't be you. If fear was plucky, and globes were square, and dirt was cleanly, and tears were glee, things would seem fair, yet they'd all despair, for if here was there, we wouldn't be we. Humanity, I love you, because you would rather black the boots of success than inquire whose soul dangles from his watch chain, which would be embarrassing for both parties, and because you unflinchingly applaud all songs containing the words country, home, and mother when sung at the old Howard. Humanity, I love you, because when you're hard up, you pawn your intelligence to buy a drink, and when you're flush, pride keeps you from the pawn shops, and because you are continually committing nuisances, but more especially in your own house. Humanity, I love you, because you are perpetually putting the secret of life in your pants and forgetting it's there, and sitting down on it, and because you are forever making poems in the lap of death. Humanity, I hate you. In the first stanza, personification is demonstrated in the poem If by E. E. Cummings, when freckles and measles are given human characteristics, while the personification is emphasized through the rhyme scheme A, B, A, 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 B. In the second stanza, visual imagery is displayed in the ironic statements because it offers a new perspective on how to identify wrongdoings. The rhyme scheme is C, D, C, 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 D. In the third stanza, you can see imagery as well because the ironic statements also exemplify how the world would be if things were different. Both stanzas invoke a visual sensation as the reader tries to picture the scene as they connect the dots of E. E. Cummings' intentions. Repetition is exemplified throughout the whole poem because they all begin with if and end with if blank wouldn't be blank. This emphasizes how unrealistic are inquiries of how the world would be if it were different. The message of the poem is to appreciate the nature of the world because Cummings is critical of the adversary environment he conjures for the readers. In the poem Humanity, I Love You, the first stanza shows a metaphorical comparison through the line because you would rather blacken the boots of success than inquire whose soul dangles from his watch chain, which would be embarrassing for both parties. Cummings intends to show humans would rather demonstrate selfish actions like doing anything to gain success than care of someone's death. The second stanza uses critical tone when discussing American nationalism, since Cummings includes the external world only through the use of the pronoun you and words like unflinchingly, which holds a negative connotation when described with the action of applauding, as though Cummings believes there should be something to flinch about. The third and fourth stanza, Cummings shows continues the show to explore his observations of humanity, now explaining that when people go through hardships, they sacrifice their intelligence for a drink. Adversely, when people are embarrassed or flesh pride consumes them, so they don't go out for a drink because they refuse to turn to anyone, even substance, to cope or help them. Cummings uses the elements of alcohol and pride to symbolize the human nature is submissive to objective concepts. Fifth stanza shows the metaphor for the secret of life as morals, meaning people often forget the guide of their actions even though morals should be as present as something in your pants. Cummings then says the secret of life is crushed as people have no morals at all. In the sixth stanza, Cummings once again criticizes the state of society that everyone is focused on death when they should be focused on peace. With historical context, one should note this poem was written during World War II, and Cummings was a pacifist at the time. He abruptly ends the poem with "I hate you" to ensure the reader is fully aware he has been criticizing humanity and discussing his extensive feelings for humanity sarcastically. Cummings uses enjambment throughout the entire poem, which is the continuation of phrases or sentences with no end or period, and neglects to capitalize words until a new idea is present. This is an example of his intrinsic style discussed earlier. Irony is ever present and emits a confused tone for the reader due to his contrast of critical tone of humanity and repetition of "I love you." Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you. Carry your heart with me, I carry it in my heart. I'm never without it. Wherever you go, I go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever the moon has always meant, and whatever the sun will always sing is you. And here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. carry your heart. Carry it in my heart. I carry